The harbor is quiet now. Thousands of landing craft bob gently against worn rope moorings, their ramps closed, their engines cold. The water reflects grey skies and empty decks. These vessels once carried men toward beaches under fire. Now they wait in silence, clustered together in bays and inlets across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, across waterways most Americans will never see. The paint is already beginning to peel. Salt corrodes the hinges. Seabirds rest on gun mounts that no one will man again. It is the autumn of 1945, and the war is over. But what do you do with an invasion fleet when there are no more invasions to launch? The United States Navy had built more landing ships and landing craft than any military force in history. They were the workhorses of amphibious warfare, the vessels that made island hopping possible, that carried armies across the Channel on D-Day, that pushed through the Pacific from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. LSTs, LCIs, LCMs, LCMs, LCVP. Each designation represented a different size, a different purpose, but the same essential function. Get men and equipment from ship to shore, get them there alive. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Navy possessed over 80,000 landing craft of various types. 80,000. The number is difficult to comprehend even now. Entire coves were filled with them, anchorages stretched for miles, dense with the hulls of vessels that had been essential one month and expendable the next. The men who had crewed them were already going home. Demobilization happened faster than anyone had planned. Soldiers and sailors who had fought across 2 oceans wanted nothing more than to return to the lives they had left behind. The military had anticipated a slower drawdown, a measured transition, but the public demanded their sons and husbands back immediately. Politicians responded. The greatest military force ever assembled began to dissolve almost overnight. In the Philippines, landing craft sat abandoned at their moorings. Crews simply walked off, leaving equipment behind, doors unlocked, logbooks open to the last entry. In Okinawa, hundreds of vessels lay beached along the shoreline, their ramps down in the sand. No one left to pull them back to sea. The urgency that had defined every moment of wartime logistics evaporated the instant peace was declared. A young ensign stationed in the Marshall Islands later recalled walking through a depot of landing craft in late September. He had been assigned to conduct an inventory, to account for the vessels under his command. But there were too many. He walked for an hour between rows of LCVPs and never reached the end. Most had their keys still in the ignition. Some still had ammunition boxes secured to the decks. He found one with a sailor's jacket hung on a bulkhead, as if the man had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. The Navy faced a question with no precedent. What do you do with 80,000 vessels you no longer need? The obvious answer was to bring them home, to return them to American ports and shipyards. But that presented immediate problems. The cost of sailing tens of thousands of landing craft across the Pacific was astronomical. Fuel alone would consume resources needed for the ongoing occupation of Japan and the repatriation of troops. Crews were sparse. Many of the craft were already in poor condition, battered by years of hard use in saltwater and combat. Then there was the question of where to put them. American harbors were already crowded. The shipyards that had built these vessels at extraordinary speed during wartime had no capacity to store them, no facilities designed for mothballing a fleet of this size. Civilian shipping needed to resume, commerce needed berths. The wartime machinery that had produced this armada had no corresponding system for its preservation. So the Navy made decisions. Some were practical, some were expedient. Many were simply a recognition that the world had changed, and these vessels belonged to a war that was already receding into memory. The first decision was to assess value. Naval architects and planners divided the landing craft into categories. Which vessels had potential peacetime use? Which were too worn or too specialized? Which could be sold? Which should be preserved? Which could simply be abandoned? The larger vessels, the LSTs and the LSMs, had commercial potential. Their flat bottoms and bow ramps made them useful for cargo transport in shallow ports. Their capacity to beach themselves meant they could operate in regions without developed harbor infrastructure. These ships, the Navy reasoned, could be sold or transferred to foreign governments, to shipping companies, to anyone willing to take on their maintenance. Hundreds of LSTs were transferred to Allied nations as part of post-war aid agreements. Britain took them, France, the Netherlands, nationalist China received dozens to support operations along its coast and rivers. The Soviet Union, despite the emerging tensions that would define the Cold War, received a small number under Lend-Lease agreements that were still being fulfilled. The transfers happened quickly, often with minimal ceremony. Ships were delivered to foreign crews who barely knew how to operate them. Training was cursory. Documentation was incomplete. Some vessels sailed under new flags within weeks of the war's end, their American markings hastily painted over, their new purposes uncertain. Other LSTs were sold to commercial operators. Shipping companies saw opportunity. These ships were cheap, abundant and versatile. They could haul freight to ports in Alaska, in the Caribbean, in the developing Pacific. Some became car ferries. Others transported livestock. A few were converted into passenger vessels for routes where comfort mattered less than capacity. But the vast majority of landing craft was smaller. LCVPs, the Higgins boats that had carried men onto the beaches of Normandy and Iwo Jima. LCMs for vehicles and tanks. LCIs for infantry. These vessels had little commercial value. They were too small, too specialized, too worn. For these craft, the Navy authorized abandonment. It is a strange word to apply to military equipment. Abandonment suggests negligence, a failure of duty. But in the late summer and fall of 1945, abandonment was official policy. Landing craft were declared surplus, excess to requirements. Crews were ordered to beach them, to moor them, to leave them where they sat. Thousands upon thousands of vessels were simply left behind in the harbors and bays, and inlets where the war had ended. In the Philippines, entire lagoons became graveyards. The water was shallow, the climate unforgiving. Wooden hulls rotted quickly in the tropical heat, metal corroded. Within a year, many craft were little more than skeletal frames protruding from the waterline. Local fishermen stripped them for materials. Children played in the rusting compartments. The jungle grew over those pulled onto shore. In the Marshall Islands, in the Marianas, in dozens of anchorages across the Pacific, the same pattern repeated. Landing craft sat abandoned until they sank, or were scrapped, or simply disappeared beneath vegetation and tide. No one kept detailed records. No one tracked their final disposition. They had served their purpose. The war was over. That was enough. Some were scuttled deliberately. The Navy towed them into deep water and opened their seacocks, sending them to the ocean floor to avoid the expense of any other solution. Others were used for target practice, shot full of holes during training exercises, their service ending in a final simulation of the combat they had survived. A chaplain stationed on Guam wrote in his journal about watching a group of LCVPs being burned on a beach. The Navy had decided they were too damaged to salvage and too costly to transport, so they were dragged onto the sand, doused with fuel, and set alight. He watched the smoke rise into the humid sky and thought about the men who had ridden in those boats. He wondered if they knew. He wondered if they would care. But even as thousands were abandoned, a smaller number were brought home. The Navy reserved a portion of the fleet for potential future use. War planners, even in the euphoria of victory, understood that peace might not last. The lessons of amphibious warfare had been learned at great cost. The capability needed to be preserved. Several hundred LSTs were mothballed at naval facilities along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. They were cleaned, drained, sealed. Engines were preserved with protective coatings. Compartments were dried and ventilated. They sat in long rows at reserve basins in California, in Virginia, in Washington state, silent, waiting. These mothballed vessels represented a kind of optimism, a belief that if war came again, America would be ready. But they also represented something more ambiguous. They were artifacts of a specific kind of warfare, a specific historical moment. The atomic bomb had ended the war in the Pacific. The nature of conflict was already changing. Whether massed amphibious assaults would ever be necessary again was an open question. Years passed. The mothballed fleet sat undisturbed through the late 1940s. Then came Korea. In June 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The United States responded, committing troops and resources to defend the South. And suddenly, amphibious capability mattered again. The Navy pulled LSTs out of mothballs, rushed them back into service. They landed Marines at Incheon in September 1950, a daring operation that turned the tide of the early war. The landing ships that had been declared excess just 5 years earlier were essential once more. But even this revival was temporary. After Korea, the ships returned to reserve status. Some were modernized. Most simply went back into storage. The strategic calculus was shifting. Aircraft carriers dominated naval thinking. Nuclear weapons redefined deterrence. Amphibious assault, while still part of military doctrine, was no longer the centerpiece it had been during World War II. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the reserve fleet slowly diminished. Ships were scrapped as they aged beyond economical repair. Steel prices fluctuated, and when they rose, the Navy sold vessels for scrap metal. Cutting torches dismantled LSTs in shipyards from Oakland to Philadelphia. The metal was melted down, repurposed, transformed into automobiles and appliances and construction materials. The physical substance of the invasion fleet dispersed back into the civilian economy. A few found stranger fates. One LST was converted into a floating restaurant in San Francisco Bay. Another became a church in the Pacific Northwest, its hull modified to support a chapel and community center. Several were sold to researchers and used as platforms for oceanographic studies. One was deliberately sunk off the coast of Florida to create an artificial reef, its compartments now home to fish and coral rather than cargo and troops. Others served in conflicts far from American shores. Surplus landing craft sold or transferred in the 1940s and 50s appeared in regional wars across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. They landed troops in Suez, in Vietnam, in countless smaller conflicts that never made international headlines. Some of these vessels remained in service into the 1980s, decades after they were built, operated by nations that lacked the resources for newer equipment. The wooden-hulled craft deteriorated fastest. LCVPs and smaller landing boats had been built with a lifespan measured in months, not years. Those that survived into the post-war period fell apart quickly. Wood rotted, seams opened. By the 1950s, very few remained. The ones that did became curiosities, displayed at museums or kept by veterans as personal memorials. One veteran from Ohio bought a surplus LCVP in 1947 for $50. He transported it to a lake near his hometown and used it as a fishing boat. For years, neighbors would see him puttering around the water in a vessel designed to storm a beach. He never talked much about the war, but he maintained that boat meticulously, repairing and repainting, keeping it operational long after any practical need justified the effort. When he died in 1979, his children tried to donate it to a museum. None were interested. It was eventually scrapped. There is something quietly tragic about that ending. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just the slow, unremarkable dissolution of something that once mattered intensely. By the 1970s, the World War II-era landing craft were mostly gone. The few that remained in military service were relics, kept operational through constant maintenance and improvisation. The reserve fleets had been largely liquidated. The ships that had made the great amphibious campaigns possible had disappeared into scrapyards, into foreign navies, into the waters where they were abandoned 3 decades earlier. But memory persisted in unexpected places. In the Pacific Islands, in the Philippines especially, the wrecks of landing craft became part of the landscape. Rusted hulls sat half-submerged in lagoons, covered in barnacles and algae. Local communities incorporated them into daily life, using them as fishing platforms, as markers for navigation, as simply part of the scenery. Divers began exploring these wrecks in the 1980s and 90s. They found compartments filled with silt, holds that still contained remnants of cargo. Some wrecks were remarkably intact, preserved by the brackish water and relative isolation. Others had collapsed entirely, reduced to ribs and plating scattered across the seafloor. Each wreck was a small time capsule, an accidental monument to a moment when these vessels had been urgently needed and then immediately forgotten. Historians started paying attention. Museums began acquiring the few surviving examples. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans obtained an LCVP, the USS LST-305, one of the few landing ships to survive into the 21st century, was brought back to the United States in 2000 after serving in the Greek Navy for decades. It now operates as a floating museum, crewed by volunteers, a living example of a vessel type that once numbered in the thousands. These preserved ships are oddities now. They represent a kind of warfare that feels distant, almost quaint in an age of precision missiles and drone strikes. The idea of loading hundreds of men into an open boat and driving it onto a beach under fire seems to belong to a different era of human conflict entirely. Yet the landing ship represented something important. It was a solution to a specific problem: how to project power across an ocean, how to move an army from sea to land in the face of opposition. The Allies won World War II in part because they mastered this problem. They built the ships, they developed the doctrine, they executed the operations, and then, almost immediately, they dismantled the capability they had worked so hard to create. Not entirely, not permanently, but the sense of urgency vanished. The industrial mobilization ended. The ships were no longer needed in those numbers, so they were discarded. There is a broader pattern here, one that repeats across military history. Capabilities developed at enormous cost during wartime are often abandoned or neglected once peace returns. The urgency that drives innovation and production in wartime cannot be sustained. Budgets shrink, priorities shift. Equipment that was essential becomes excess. The landing craft are a particularly stark example because of the numbers involved. 80,000 vessels, built in less than 4 years, and then mostly gone within a decade. It speaks to the immense productive power of the United States during World War II, but also to the wastefulness inherent in total war. These ships were never meant to last. They were built to serve an immediate need, and when that need ended, so did their value. Some were lucky. They found second lives, new purposes, extended service under different flags, but most simply vanished. Burned, sunk, scrapped, left to rot in tropical harbors. The infrastructure that had enabled the greatest amphibious campaigns in history dissolved back into the world as if it had never existed. The men who had served on these vessels went home and rarely spoke of them. Landing craft were unglamorous. They were not battleships or aircraft carriers. They did not capture the public imagination. Crewmen were not celebrated. The vessels themselves were not commemorated. They were tools, nothing more. But they had been essential tools. Without them, the Pacific could not have been retaken. Without them, Normandy would have been impossible. The course of the war depended on these humble, flat-bottomed ships getting men from transport to shore, again and again, across dozens of beaches and thousands of miles. And then the war ended, and they were no longer needed. And that was that. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find them. Wrecks in shallow Pacific lagoons. A hull converted to a barge on the Mississippi. A museum ship carefully maintained in an American harbor. Photographs in archives showing row after row of vessels waiting for a purpose that never came. They are reminders of a particular kind of ending. Not the triumphant conclusion we imagine when we think of victory in World War II, but the quieter, more complicated aftermath. The moment when the cheering stopped and the practical questions began. What do we do with all of this? What do we keep? What can we afford to remember? Most of the landing craft were forgotten. They had served their purpose. The war was won. The men came home. The world moved on. And in moving on, it left behind these vessels, these thousands of ships that had been so urgently needed, and then so quickly discarded. The harbor is quiet now. It has been quiet for a long time. The water reflects an empty sky. The ships that once filled these anchorages are gone, reduced to rust and memory, scattered across oceans and scrapyards and the floors of tropical lagoons. They carried armies into history, and then history moved on without them, as it always does, leaving only traces for those willing to look.